underlying compositional shape that I've been talking about can be any kind of shape, actually, because you can make any kind of shape you want from these basic shapes by distorting them, by modifying them, by changing them. You don't always have to use them exactly the way they are. So, for example, I could do something like this. That becomes my underlying shape for a subject that I'm going to add to that shape. So let's say I have a figure here, and then maybe there's another figure on the other side, and the subject does not have to fall exactly within that underlying shape. Matter of fact, it shouldn't, because then that underlying shape would become too obvious, and you don't want to do that. It needs to remain hidden. Then I could have some other figures further back like that. So here is a distortion of the circle shape. See the curve, right? That's part of the circle, the basic geometric shape of the circle. Then what I could do is maybe add a shape down here that could be a triangle shape. So what I'm doing, I'm combining two different shapes, distortion of the circle shape and the triangle shape. So it's important to understand that you can combine shapes. You don't just have to use one kind of underlying or compositional shape like that. I can add others. I could add a circle, and I could even add another one. Additional shapes help to make the composition even more interesting. That part that has the greatest density of shapes, that part that is more busy, where you find more shapes, is within the compositional shape, like you see here. Then other parts that are outside of that compositional shape, like you see here, do not have that kind of activity. They're not as busy. They're more quiet. They are considered areas of economy. That's because there's not much going on there. Some things need to be added, of course, so that those other parts of the composition are not empty. But there's not as much activity, there isn't as much busyness in those other parts of the composition as takes place within the compositional shape itself. So you have busy and quiet areas. There needs to be that balance. In addition, now you might ask yourself, well, why do I need to establish a compositional shape? Well, let me show you. So let's say I have this figure here, I have another figure over here, really quick, and maybe another one here, another figure there, larger one here, another one here. So what I have here is a bunch of figure shapes scattered all over the place. But if I, let's say, make a circle, and now I add those figures to this circle shape, roughly. Remember what I said, you don't make the shapes or the objects that you draw and paint fit exactly within that compositional shape, because then it becomes too obvious. So you can have parts sticking out like that, making that compositional shape much less noticeable. So by having this compositional shape of a circle and placing those figure shapes into an arrangement that roughly resembles this underlying or implied circle shape, what I've now done is I've created order. I've grouped the shapes together, and grouping helps to create order. While in this example here, those shapes are scattered all over the place. There's no order. There's no grouping, which is another principle of design. Grouping is very important. So the underlying compositional shape helps to create order by bringing shapes together grouping them together. So it's very important that you understand this. Otherwise, what you end up with are a bunch of scattered shapes like this. And that makes for a bad composition. Let's say I don't begin with first establishing a compositional shape like that, but I begin by placing my figures here. So I have two figures here, but then I'm going to add another figure. So what I'm doing is I'm overlapping these figures and placing them close together, like you see here. This one isn't really overlapping these, but then let's say I have another one over here like this, and this foreground figure is overlapping that figure, so that figure is behind this one here. And what I have now, I have order, and that's because these figures have not been scattered around like that, but by overlapping them, by bringing them together, overlapping them and grouping them, I've already automatically created a compositional shape, which is an implied underlying shape, and that can be seen here. And you see that part sticking out. Remember I said that the shapes shouldn't fit exactly within that compositional shape. So you see, I've already created a compositional shape by not beginning first with some idea of what the compositional shape should look like, but by bringing together these figure shapes and overlapping them, which automatically creates some kind of underlying shape or compositional shape for me. And thereby, order is achieved. While if you do something like that, you have chaos. Don't scatter your shapes like that. Bring them together, overlap them like you see here and here. And also in this example, I would place the shapes that I have there so that they overlap one another, grouping them together. Always apply the principle of grouping. When you're designing a structure, think in terms of shape and line. They are your building blocks, so to speak. So for example, let's say I do something like this, in which I begin with line to work out some kind of structure that I want to base my picture on. So maybe something like this, and then another line like that. These lines can become a subject, like for example maybe a fish, and then another fish down here, establishing implied lines. The fish don't make an actual line, and therefore the line is implied. So I've started this composition with lines that are actually implied lines. And then I can add other things, maybe some vegetation here, some rocks maybe. So I can build around what I initially established. Another example in which I begin with line rather than shape. So I could maybe add this curve here. And that curve could represent a figure, let's say. That figure has this gesture in which he is curving like that, and maybe he's holding a hockey stick. That's really quick. But the pose that he has that curve to it. So I started with just that curved line, and then I can build on that line. So here's this quick rough sketch that I did of the hockey player, and I started out with just a simple curved line like that, which acted as a basis for this figure. It could have been a different subject as well. But I started out in a very simple way, not with a shape, but rather with a line. Now you can also start out with both a line and a shape. So maybe that shape becomes a row of buildings like that. And this line here becomes a figure standing in the foreground, like this. So here's an example in which both line and shape are used initially to start the composition, to start the structure. I'm going to show you the steps that I went through in developing a composition with this underlying structure that I've been talking about for a book cover that I did for a publisher. This, however, that I'm going to show you is one of the concept sketches that I did for the publisher. I did a number of them, and this one wasn't actually selected for the cover. It was a different concept sketch that was finally used, for which I did a finished painting for the cover. But I want to show you this concept sketch and how I arrived at this particular composition. And the way I start is always with thumbnail sketches. So it's first doing a lot of these little thumbnail sketches, and when you do them, you explore different possibilities. You may not have a structural concept in mind, and it's what I showed you earlier, starting with these little thumbnail sketches in which you try different arrangements, and then all of a sudden an underlying structure may come to mind. Like here, for example, this suggests a triangle. And once I have that triangle, I know that I need to establish a rhythm. Therefore, I need to repeat that triangle somewhere. So I'm repeating it over here, and then I have it here. So I've already started putting down some kind of underlying structure, even in this little sketch here. And then maybe I have something back here, which could be a circle. So I have a triangle, another triangle, and a circle. I've established a rhythm of triangles. To establish an even stronger rhythm of triangles, I'll repeat that triangle again and place something in the foreground here maybe. So already in this little rough thumbnail, I've started to establish some kind of underlying structure, but that may not be the best composition, so I continue to explore the different possibilities, and maybe I should use some kind of rhythmic structure with these rhythmic lines maybe. And maybe there's a figure here like this, and some other figures over here, and some in the background here like that. So they form a curve here, or maybe a rhythmic line like that. So you try different arrangements and see if something is suggested to you by these different arrangements as to what the underlying structure could be. But you begin in a very rough, abstract way like this, already establishing some kind of idea of what the underlying structure might be. So here I'm thinking of a rectangle shape, and I'll place a line here. So I have a horizontal, I have a vertical, establishing that cross structure, and then maybe I'll place a tree back here like this, and the figure is standing in front of the tree, which was initially represented by that vertical line that I established. And then the tree is cropped on the right side like that, maybe a row of trees, and that tree, or the row of trees back there, suggests to me an oval implied shape like that, extending outside the picture area. And then I have my rectangle shape down here, which is, let's say, a field of grass that this figure is standing in. And then I thought of doing a wraparound cover. Here's the spine for the book right there. It's called the spine. This sketch and these others, they are just for the front cover. But then I decided to extend the front cover across the spine and to the back. And then I did a little sketch of the characters, very rough. I thought of the characters over here like that. And then on this side, I was going to maybe place some trees here like this. So I came up with this really rough thumbnail sketch. And I thought of developing this further, using the wraparound cover instead of just the front cover. So I moved to a larger size, and then I started to work out that little rough thumbnail sketch in more detail, and making it more clear to me as to what the underlying structure could be. The way I started was to, first of all, place the characters of the story, and I just did that roughly like this, thinking about grouping them together, applying that principle of grouping that I talked about. And in this story there was a werewolf, and I was thinking, well, maybe I can put the werewolf in the front here like that, and he's moving forward to the left a little bit, and then back here there's an explosion that's occurring in this building that I thought of putting right there. And also there's a moon, because the scene is taking place at night, so I thought of putting a moon back here like that. And this laboratory, this building is a laboratory, is located in the woods. So therefore I thought of adding some trees here to suggest woods. There's a large tree here like this. But when I started the sketch, I didn't have an idea yet as to how I was going to arrange these trees over here. But I knew that I had to put some trees here because, like I said, this laboratory is in or near the woods. So this is a rough sketch that I initially came up with, and you can see that I already had this idea in mind of grouping the characters together like this, which resulted in an implied shape that is a triangle. And you can see that triangle, I think, clearly here, like that. Knowing that the underlying structure needs to be a rhythmic structure, this triangle needs to be repeated in order for a rhythm to be established. So I'm thinking, well, where can I repeat that? And then I'm thinking, well, maybe one of the branches here of the tree could extend over to where these characters are located and set up some kind of implied line like that, extending up, and then the other side of the triangle down like that, and over like this. And then I have that, let me repeat that, it's more like this. So this is a large triangle, then there's a smaller one inside that larger one. So I have a triangle shape here, I have one here, and then I'm thinking, well, this whole section where the trees are located, they can also set up triangles with the branches. So there needs to be a series of these triangle shapes all over the picture area. So I'm using the branches, something like this, to set up more triangle shapes. And then down here, there's the ground and some grass, which also makes a triangle shape like that. And then there's another one here. Then I have this shape, which is more of a rectangle, closer to a rectangle, and also this is closer to a rectangle, so I have two rectangles. And then to contrast more sharply with those triangles and rectangles, I added the moon, which is a circle shape, and then the werewolf here, that has a rounded triangle shape, something like that. So it's a variation of the triangle shape. The heads of the characters form circles, so I'm setting up a rhythm of these circle shapes. So here's a rough sketch of this underlying structure consisting of these basic geometric shapes of triangles, rectangles, and circles. Right here, there's a horizontal line going across, which divides the picture area, which is all of this, as you know, into two rectangle shapes. There's this big rectangle shape here, all of that, and then there's the smaller rectangle shape here. Then, what I think I'm going to do is add some leaves over here, like that. And by adding those leaves and a branch down here like that, what I've done now is I've created another triangle, like this, extending from that branch up to where the leaves are. And then I'll have some branches come down like that, and that creates yet another triangle like this, going into the side of that triangle, which is an even larger triangle. So you can see that things can get rather complicated, but you start off in a very simple way, like you saw in this example where I just began with this triangle here, which resulted from my placement of these characters, grouping them together like that. And then I started adding other shapes and elements, and the structure started getting a bit more complicated. But it's always important to start in a very simple way, and then you build on that, and things become more complicated. And it all depends on you, just how complicated you want that structure to become. But the more simple the structure, the better the painting is going to be, the better the composition is going to be. Try to keep things as simple as possible. Although in this case, things have gotten a little more complicated because I have quite a few elements here in this picture. What I'm going to do now is jump ahead and show you the actual finished painting. And here is what the finished painting looks like. Underlying this subject is that structure that I showed you earlier. So let me sketch that in again quickly over this more realistic looking image. So the triangle shape is right there that I talked about. Now the eye of the viewer is led by the underlying structure to the center of interest, which is located right here, where these figures are, specifically the man right there. And this triangle shape acts as a kind of frame for these characters and the werewolf here, and therefore the eye is led by way of this implied shape to these characters, because that triangle shape acts as a kind of frame. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the circle here also is a powerful shape that attracts attention, a lot of attention. Also, I mentioned that there was a large triangle shape here, like that, and coming over like that. This line of that larger triangle leads the eye over toward the figures. Now, there's a horizontal line here, which actually I want to extend, and it doesn't extend, so what I'm going to do is add something over here, like that. This branch, you see that right there? That branch coming out like that. And change it a little bit. Something like this. That branch helps to extend this horizontal line over. So this line is picked up by this branch here, or some debris that's lying there, whatever it is, so that I can get that rectangle shape that I pointed out to you earlier, which is this. And then there's that larger rectangle shape. In the earlier structure sketch, I indicated that there was a large triangle shape here, like that. However, as I'm looking at this painting, I can see that this implied line, which runs along the edge here, or it's implied by that edge that there is a line there, even though there isn't an actual line. I don't get the feeling that that implied line is extending down like that, helping me to create this larger triangle shape. So what do you do in a case like that? Well, I come down here and I add some sky like that. And just by adding those little bits of sky, now I get the feeling that there is an extended implied line running down like that. Can you see it? It's subtle, and that's the way it should be. It should not be obvious. Matter of fact, this debris here that helps to extend that line might be a little too lined up with that line over there. So to make it a bit less obvious, I could bring down that branch a little bit, like this. And say like that, and you still get the feeling, but in a more subtle way, that there is this implied line going across. Now you might say, well, this implied line is leading up and away from the center of interest. Aren't the lines supposed to lead to the center of interest? Yes, they should, but in some cases you may have lines that are leading in a different direction, but what you do in that case is you have a line going in a different direction like this, but then you have other lines that counter that direction and lead you in a different direction and to the center of interest. You see these branches here, they're stopping this line from moving up and out and away from the center of interest. So these branches are pointing down toward the center of interest, which is right here. So that's what you do when you have lines that are moving in a different direction. You have to bring the eye back to the center of interest. So you have some lines leading to other parts of the picture, and those other parts lead back to the center of interest. Now, when you look over here where the forest is, or these trees, you see more triangles. These branches are dividing that space into triangles. These triangle shapes can be found all over the painting. Matter of fact, right here where this werewolf is, there is a rounded triangle, which I mentioned earlier in that rough structure sketch. So you have a triangle that looks like this, and then you have other triangles that look more like actual triangles. That is an implied triangle shape. So there's this variation of different shapes that helps to add more interest, because all the shapes don't look exactly the same. And a matter of fact, there's also a triangle shape right here. And that triangle shape looks different from this one. And then that triangle shape that I mentioned earlier, that larger one, looks different from both of these. So I'm getting that variation of shape in there to make it a more interesting structure, a more interesting rhythm. And then right here, there's another triangle shape. And then there's that big triangle shape here in the foreground like that. So they're all over the place. Now here's how I started out in a very simple way, just grouping these figures together like this. You're working with a limited number of basic shapes. You're working with the triangle, the square, and the circle, and you're creating variations. So you're working in a very economical way. If things look complicated, they're really not, because all you're doing is repeating shapes. The same kind of shape is being repeated. So if I'm using the triangle shape, like I've shown you, and I started out like this, and then as I'm adding other shapes, other elements, I'm just repeating that triangle shape here and here, like I showed you, all over the place. So I don't have 10, 15 different kinds of shapes. I have a limited number of shapes that I'm working with, that I'm creating variations of. Larger triangles, wider triangles, narrower triangles, smaller triangles, bigger ones, and so on. And all I'm doing is just repeating those triangles with variations all over the place. So it's not that complicated. And then if I have a different basic shape like the circle, again, all I'm doing is repeating that circle, and I may use an oval, a variation of the circle, and then I may repeat that oval again, and so on. So you're applying the principle of economy because you're not working with a lot of different shapes. You're working only with a limited number of shapes. And in some cases, all you use are two shapes. You have the circle, and then you need a contrasting shape like the rectangle or the square that you just keep repeating. And here we are back again to this painting. You might notice that the painting looks somewhat darker. And that's because I decided to darken the entire painting. The values look a little too light. And in Photoshop, it's easy to darken the painting. You just go to the Image menu, down to Adjustments, and over to Levels. And then you just move the middle slider over toward the right, and it darkens the entire painting, if you need to darken your painting. And that's about all I'm going to do on this painting. Implied lines establish continuity, as you know, because I've been talking about this throughout the video. I'm going to do two rough diagram sketches here. So I'm going to add a line here, and then a line over here, and these represent implied lines. Then I'll add one here, another one down here, one here, another one there, maybe one over here, and another one there, one here, and another one there. Let me change that, and maybe I'll just add one like that. Then over on this side, again, I'll add implied lines. Now when you look at this example, and you look at this one, which one of these two do you get a greater feeling of order from? I think you would probably say this one. And the reason for that is because there is continuity in this example, but in this one there is no continuity. Because in this example, the lines, this one and that one, for example, they align, forming an implied line like that. This line continues into that one, thereby forming continuity. And this kind of continuity of these implied lines produces order within the composition. Now, this is what you find in nature. This is chaotic, while man creates this kind of order. So this is man-made order, and this is nature. Here's another example of man-made order, where everything is nice and regular like that. While in nature, the lines are going all over the place like that. The ideal composition isn't a rigid order like you see here. The ideal composition is one in which some of this chaos is included in the order established. So the ideal composition is not one in which there is just strict regularity like this, or extreme order like this, but a little bit of the irregular, one could say, a little bit of chaos is also found within the man-made order. So a bit more of a more natural state than exists within the composition. So in the perfect ordered composition, every line connects up with another line. While in nature, there aren't any lines, but I'm talking about implied lines. They don't line up with each other like they do in man-made order. So you have these implied lines in nature going all over the place. Now, to get some of this chaos, or the more natural state, into a more ordered composition, so that the ordered composition doesn't appear too regular, too rigid, too ordered, some implied lines need to be introduced that don't connect up with other implied lines, that don't form this kind of continuity, but rather breaks it. So in a diagram example like this, what it would look like is something like this, where I have a line here and then maybe another one down here. But this one doesn't connect up with that one. It doesn't align with that one. Or I could have another line here and then one up there like that. So now I've introduced a bit of the kind of chaos that you find in nature into this man-made order, thereby preventing this ordered arrangement to appear too ordered. And this helps to give a greater feeling of a more natural state to the composition. It feels more natural and not so contrived looking, which results when you create this kind of perfect order where everything is lined up and regular looking. When you begin to work out your composition and you try to establish this kind of continuity that I'm talking about, there are automatically going to be implied lines that don't line up with each other. So even if you don't consciously apply this kind of chaos that I'm talking about, it's going to happen anyway. Therefore, you have to focus on establishing these kind of implied lines that connect up with each other. And then automatically you're also going to have lines, implied lines, that do not align with each other like you see here. So you're going to get both a little bit of chaos, but then you should have a lot more of the order than the chaos. So therefore you have to consciously apply as many connections as you feel are necessary so that order dominates and not disorder. So you can have a few disconnected implied lines where there is no continuity, where the continuity is broken, but then the other implied lines need to form this kind of connection that I'm talking about, which helps to move the eye through a composition from one part to another, as I've been showing you in the video. And these lines that connect up with each other, they connect one part of the composition with another. So you can have an implied line way over here and another one way over there, and even though they are far apart, but they align with each other, they will look like they're connected, and one line will then connect up with the other one. Remember that it's not just the edges of shapes that I've been showing you that produce these implied lines, but the shapes themselves, when repeated like this, form implied lines. The eye follows those shapes. That's an implied line. And then if I, let's say, add a shape over here like that, and the edge of that shape aligns with that edge of that shape, now I have an implied line here. So I have both line and shape that creates this kind of continuity. Let's say you're ready to design your composition. You have something in mind that you want to say. Let's say you want to communicate this idea of victory. This character is victorious. Then you need to think about what kind of structural concept would help to get this idea across, would communicate what I want to say. So then you think about, well, what do you associate with victory? Victory can be expressed maybe by having a structural concept that has an upward movement like that. It's like the character is so joyous, so happy that he or she has won, is victorious, that they jump up in the air with their hands up in the air to get that feeling across, that mood. So this then becomes the structural concept, this upward movement like that victorious feeling. So let's say there's a figure standing here with his arms raised and he's holding some kind of weapon. And he's standing on a rock, let's say. And then way down here you can see the landscape, the distant hills. Or, better yet, maybe instead of those distant hills, I add a castle here. And that castle's pointing up like that, just as he is pointing upward like that. So that's strengthening or reinforcing his pose. So something like this maybe. This upward movement that I've established has this triangle-like shape to it, and it's actually a modified or distorted triangle. So here's the triangle. So what I've done is I've caved in the sides so they're concave and not straight like in a regular triangle. If you remember, I said that you can distort these basic shapes that you use to construct the underlying structure with. And that's what I've done in this case. I've distorted the triangle. And if you remember, I also said that these shapes need to be repeated that you use for the underlying structure. So since I'm using this triangle-like shape to get this feeling of an upward movement, an upward thrust across, I'm also repeating that triangle shape over here where the castle is, thereby strengthening this feeling of an upward movement, because this shape also is moving upward. And that really strengthens this mood that I'm trying to get across of victory quite a bit. To strengthen that upward movement even more, I could add another one of these triangular-like shapes. And I could add that over here. Maybe this mountain is rising up like that. Thereby, I now have another shape, another triangular shape, that repeats this direction of the main or largest triangular shape upward. And then this one upward and that one upward. And I'm repeating that compositional motif, as it's also referred to, which I'm using in this case. And this repetition fulfills one of the requirements of a good composition, which is the repetition of an element of design, and shape is one of those elements of design. This upward movement becomes the design theme. Now, think back to my other videos in which I talk about design themes. And if you remember what you've learned from those videos, then you'll know that this upward movement is a design theme. A design theme, as I mentioned in those other videos on design composition, is a plan or a pattern or a symbol. And I talk about these in those videos on design themes. If you don't remember what you've learned from those videos, I would suggest that you go back and restudy them. Each of these that you see here can become a design theme. A plan, if you remember, is a plan of organization. A plan of organization imposes order upon the subject. A pattern is formed when a shape or a value, for example, is repeated, like in my example here, in which I repeat this triangular shape. And a symbol can be a design theme, and in my case here, this triangular shape is a symbol because it symbolizes this feeling or mood of victory because of the upward movement that it has. It has this upward direction. And an upward direction like this is associated with victory. So all three of these are actually part of a design theme. So when you're planning a design theme where you have some kind of plan in mind, such as in this example, which is repetition with variation of size, you've established a plan of organization which imposes order upon the subject. In addition, there is the design theme of a symbol, because this triangular-like shape that has this upward direction, this upward movement, is a symbol for victory, because you associate upward movement like this with a feeling of victory. Applying a plan, a pattern, and a symbol also is part of the structural concept. If you think back to the examples that I've shown you, they all include a plan, a pattern, and a symbol. So all three of these are part of the structural concept, which actually is also a design theme. If you don't yet understand this very well, then you probably haven't seen my videos on design themes and plans of organization and all those other things that are part of composition. So if you haven't seen those videos, it's important that you watch them in order to gain a better understanding of what I've talked about here. And now it's time to get back to what I started talking about when I made this little diagram with these implied lines here. But I needed to also talk about this because this is the structural concept that I'm working with, or design theme. Whichever terminology is used is fine, because a design theme can be the structural concept, or the structural concept can be a design theme. So let's say you have your design theme or structural concept, and you've started to arrange your shapes, like in my example here. You're working with the structural concept, but you also have to think about these implied lines that I've been talking about, which further help to impose order upon the subject. Now the plan of organization that I established here with these triangle shapes repeated like this, setting up a pattern and a rhythm, they also impose order upon the subject, but then there's also a question of implied lines that need to be established. So what I'm going to do here is add, let's say, this cape that he has on, and his cape is blowing in the wind and actually being kicked up like that, repeating the upward direction of the triangle shape, thereby strengthening this upward movement even more. And then I'm thinking of where can I add these implied lines, where is the continuity that can be established so that the eye can move through the composition. As you can see, I've carried this sketch somewhat further, and I want to focus on the implied lines. So for example, in red here, you can see that this is an implied line moving up like that. Another implied line is established here, moving up like that. You can see this edge being picked up here at the edge of the cape and moving up like that. So that's an implied line, and they are moving in the direction of his head, which is the focal point. In addition, what I'm going to do is add some lines down here and here. This could be maybe a road. This road that I just added helps to draw the eye into the picture and is picked up by the edge of the rock here. So an implied line is formed that is moving in the direction of the center of interest, which is the figure. So it's pointing to the figure, just as these other lines, these other implied lines, are pointing to the center of interest. This triangle shape back here that I pointed out to you earlier has implied lines. The edges of the shapes form an implied line. The weapon that he's holding doesn't point to any other lines, isn't picked up by other lines. And that then refers to the bit of chaos that I pointed out to you here, where not all lines connect up with other lines. There's another implied line that is a curve, which can be seen here. Moving down like that, picked up by the rock, picked up by a distant mountain, and then along this castle here, and up like that. So that forms a curved implied line, and that in combination with these triangles here form this kind of rhythm. The road that I added disappeared on me, so I'm going to add that back. And over on the other side, I'm also going to add a road here as well, which is then picked up by this edge of the rock over here, creating a movement into the picture from the right toward the center of interest. Adding the other implied lines, and this one gives me this kind of structure so far, and this line here. The weapon that he's holding stops all of this movement from going up and out of the picture at the top. That's the stopper. With the addition of these roads over here, you get that feeling of this curving and upward implied line. See it? You feel that movement? There is another implied line that I haven't mentioned yet, which is the one that is formed by the bottom of these triangle shapes, right here. That's an implied line, and it is picked up on the other side over here by another implied line. And then you have that invisible line between them, connecting those two lines, forming a horizontal, and then I'll add that other structure, and combining all of these implied lines creates this structure here. This horizontal implied line creates a big rectangle here, a two-dimensional shape. It has height, it has width, but it does not have any depth. And then there's a smaller rectangle shape down here. So there's a dominant shape and a subdominant shape. The rectangle is an additional motif to the more triangular-like motif. And in addition to these two motifs, I could add a third one. And maybe up here, like this, there's a planet. This is a fantasy picture. And by adding that circle, or part of a circle, I've introduced an additional motif, so I have a circle as well. Decided to move the circle over toward the left a little bit more so that this part of the figure sits within that circle and thereby is framed by the circle. And that helps to further draw the eye to the focal point, which is the head. In addition, there's a low eye level. You're looking up at this figure, which further helps to strengthen this feeling of an upward movement. And that's about all I'm going to do on this rough sketch. I could keep going, but it's time to end this little course on the structural concept. It's very important that you understand all of this and are able to apply it to your own work. Being able to do that will make all the difference between a mediocre work and a really great painting. Thanks for watching. Until next time, goodbye.